sound of the laugh. I feel like, you know, like, don't talk to you. Anyway, thank you. Oh, my Lord.
What side? What side? On east side, what side? Okay, no, I don't know what side. I don't know.
We live in 8 Mile and Chief.
Okay, well, that's not too far. I think you said that.
Except for you.
Oh, it's fine. Absolutely. But I was working on it.
We should grab her.
Peter was going to warm up. I love you.
Daniel, where would you like it? Oh, okay. Here, or should we be sitting anywhere? Or?
You can see anywhere and then you can count.
So, well, how did you get from the?
Okay.
The father. My husband worked for
So welcome to a very international and internationalist panel we've got here. Very interesting. So we have 3 presentations. Just waiting to get set up for our first presentation by Melissa Olios. But we are missing our 3rd presenter, Bright Geassi, and good thing he's the last one.
Maybe you can
Right? So,
maybe you can fill in for me.
Oh,
But you're international.
Is it the first one?
no problem.
Yes.
Yeah, well, actually,
Q&A
I
again.
actually edited the paper, so he wrote it for my class. So I can vicariously represent him, right? Okay. So let me just, in the interest of saving some time, introduce our first presenter. So the way we're going to do this is we will wait for the question and answer after all the presentations are done. Okay. So our first presenter. You're almost there?
Yes.
Great, okay. So I'm going to introduce you, Melissa. So our first presenter, Melissa Tolios, is a PhD student from cohort 25, right? And who is majoring in HMS. Who is coming from the Chicago area, and Melissa's focus is on the cultural conservation of indigenous rights. Second time presenting Melissa, so a role model. We want to encourage our students to submit to the next one as well. So, okay, if you are ready, Melissa, we can start. And so you have about 19 minutes. So whenever you're ready, I'll start timing you, and I'll probably just give you a signal when you have 5 minutes and then 2 minutes. Okay?
I was preparing about 15, so we should be fine.
Great. So go for it.
So, when I use the term conservation or nature preserve, what comes to mind? Do you think of the wide variety of animals that maybe need to be protected from poachers and traders? Or maybe think of all the plants and the trees that are threatened by illegal loggers and miners? What about the people that live there? Do they come to mind at all? Don't worry, you're not alone. Most people don't think about indigenous cultures living in preserves. Big international conservation organizations do, though. And they see native cultures as a threat to their conservation efforts. The common practice is to remove all human influence from those areas for the sake of the new preserve, for the protection of the environment. And so indigenous populations, they're removed from their homes and they're forbidden to hunt on the lands that their families have inhabited for millennia in some cases. And once they're moved to shanty towns or integrated into cities, what happens to their cultural traditions and their ways of life? What about their oral histories, their languages, their rituals, their beliefs, what opportunities are left to them? Around the world, there exists a problem that Mark Dowie refers to as a conflict of good guy versus good guy. On the one hand, conservationists work very hard to protect delicate ecosystems that, quite frankly, humankind cannot live without. And they know firsthand the amount of destruction that people can cause and the strain that they can put on the environment. But on the other hand, indigenous peoples have lived in reasonable harmony with their environment for countless generations. And those regions thrive because they're protected by their human guardians. In regions where indigenous people live freely according to their beliefs and their customs, the environment is healthy. Endangered species populations actually increase. There's biodiversity with species that often don't exist anywhere else. So these two entities, the big hand conservation organizations and the indigenous communities, they should cooperate together toward the same goals, right? I mean, they both want a healthy, thriving environment. They both want to protect the region and keep it as pristine as possible. It's not that easy. See, when conservationists react to people inside a protected environment, they tend to lump everyone together as a threat, indigenous and intruder alike. And let's be honest, indigenous cultures that have dealt with invaders and intruders for centuries, they aren't likely to reach out to corporate white Westerners for fair negotiations. The result is that the indigenous are expelled from their homes and they're moved away from their hunting grounds and their water sources. If they disobey and try to go home, they're treated as poachers on their own lands. Once that happens, what kinds of possibilities are available to them? So how widespread is this problem really? How many cultures and in what regions of the world have actually been affected? Well, in Africa, we have the Maasai in the Serengeti, the Bushman people of the Kalahari, the forest people of Central Africa, the Ogiek, Kenya's first people, and the Mursi of Ethiopia. In Southeast Asia, there are the Karen of Thailand, the Van Gujar nomads of India, the Adivasi, who aren't even recognized by India as indigenous people, and the Pribumi, Indonesia's first people. In Asia are the Tsa-Aden of Mongolia. And in South America, we have the Kayapo in the Brazilian Amazon, and the Uwa of Colombia. All told, Mark Dowie estimates that 20 to 50 million people have been displaced for the sake of conservation. It happens frequently enough that a term was created for these cultures and others, conservation refugees. And think about that for a minute. They aren't refugees because they're fleeing from war, a dictatorship, from starvation and poor water sources. They're refugees because their land is seen as more valuable than they are. A journalist and activist named Stephen Corey talks about how it happens. He says, quote, "The people are bribed with a fistful of rupees to give up the land which has sustained their families for countless generations. More often than not, promises are broken. Tribes are repeatedly told that if they don't get out, their homes and their crops will be destroyed and they'll get nothing. And when they finally cave into the pressure, conservationists call it voluntary relocation." can anyone build opportunities for themselves in a world like that? Now, we can't presume that all of the people associated with these conservation organizations are aware that this is happening. But we also can't just presume that they're all innocent either. In 2012, there was a scandal involving the World Wildlife Fund. King Juan Carlos served as Spain's WWF president until a photo was leaked. Technical difficulties. There we go. And here he is with his big game hunting trophy while he was in Botswana. Remember those Bushmen people I mentioned a few minutes ago? This is their region. They weren't allowed to hunt antelope, which is plentiful. But a nation's top WWF exec was allowed to kill a vulnerable species for sport. The whole point of getting rid of the indigenous people is that it's supposed to protect the animals and the environment. You can see how well that worked. Unfortunately, this kind of thing isn't uncommon, and it really adds insult to injury. People are ousted from their homes for the sake of environmental conservation. And then those conservation groups encourage ecotourism. But ecotourism has been proven to increase pollution and damage to the nearby environment. The real trouble is that the largest conservation efforts are viewed and implemented from a very Western perspective. We can all argue endlessly about our views on conservation, climate change, biodiversity, but most of us see humanity as separate from nature. We stand apart from it. We don't coexist with it. But that's the problem right there. We don't coexist with nature. But we must not presume that that applies to all cultures. In fact, research evidence points to just the opposite. This is the Xingu Indigenous Park in the Brazilian Amazon. The middle section, outlined in pink, that's the combined territory of several indigenous communities. The red represents deforestation. So look at that. In less than 10 years, the entire region suffered losses from deforestation, except where indigenous people kept intruders out. This is the natural way for them. This is their home, and they're perfectly capable of protecting it. They aren't a threat. They're a huge benefit to conservation efforts. When indigenous groups are evicted from their homes, you can be certain they don't just accept it. Their options, their opportunities are limited, but many do try to fight. Some resist physically, but the result is almost always harsher treatment. As I mentioned earlier, those who return to their homes are arrested, beaten, even shot as poachers on a protected preserve. The only other recourse for resistance is to fight a legal battle. But that means learning Westerner languages, Westerner politics, Westerner laws, Westerner rules of social dynamics and activism. And once a culture begins traveling down that path, they risk losing elements of their own culture. While they fight in outsider courts, they miss opportunities to teach their youths about their own histories, their own heritage, their languages. When they pass down and learn outsider languages to deal with these issues, the nuances of their own languages begin to diminish generation after generation. And while they march in the streets for equality and indigenous rights, their unique cultural behaviors become muddied by involvement in outsider practices. In short, they become more globalized like the rest of us. And the elements that make each culture unique become washed out and dimmed, sometimes lost entirely. So what's the alternative? What possibilities are left? Just the most obvious one. Big international conservation organizations need to rethink their policies and their values. They need to embrace indigenous cultures as allies and not police them as criminals. They need to elevate Native peoples as stewards of the lands that they already live in and protect. Unfortunately, the indigenous people themselves don't get to make this decision. But they can support and promote the idea of stewardship. These indigenous organizations are already established and on board. They all embrace the responsibility of stewardship, even standing against big conservation organizations to do it. If we want to build opportunities and possibilities for indigenous communities, it can't be done by sacrificing their ways of life. It has to be through collaboration with conservation groups, with both sides working to protect the region. Native communities protect the land, and conservationists support those cultures with legal pursuits and social activism. If the laws and the human rights failures of the outside world can come crashing in on these cultures and uproot them, then it is up to that outside world to fix those errors and call out those failures. And if we don't, then we are responsible for the loss of those people's ways of life, their beliefs, their languages. Because when an outside entity holds all the power, there are no real possibilities for people. Just choices between bad and worse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa.
Thank you.
And, we will go now to Dr. Walden Teachout's presentation. Please write down your questions and comments, and we will have ample time for our Q&A. Dr. Teachout has taught at the Union Institute and University's Leadership, Public Policy, Literature, and Writing program for 12 years. Dr. Teachout has won not only one, but 2 Fulbright research fellowships. They are very hard to get, very prestigious. One recently in Kyrgyzstan. Just came back from
Romania. Just came back from Romania.
From Romania.
4
Also,
years
the
ago.
previous one. Okay,
Yeah.
the previous one was Kyrgyzstan. Dr. Teachout has a PhD in American Studies from Harvard, and with a research focus on historical memory and national identity. So, it's your floor.
Great, thank you. Well, this presentation is basically an advertisement for Fulbright program. Take a look, and it is much more accessible than you may think. It is a very prestigious program, and it is also possible to get them, especially to places like Kyrgyzstan. So I chose it carefully for my first one. So I'd love to talk with anyone about it. But my presentation is really, I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a story of a research project that I did in Kyrgyzstan when I went. My Fulbright was really a teaching Fulbright, but I also wanted to work with Kyrgyz colleagues. And I was going in kind of curious about how to negotiate my role as a Westerner, right? I wasn't totally naive. I was pretty clear that it was not my job to determine what we would work on. It was not my job to determine how we would do it. I saw myself more as a midwife. Like here I have a certain set of tools and scholarly, capacities, and how can I work with someone else to really follow their lead? And I'm not the one cutting the baby out, right? But this is so. I have 6 children, so midwife analogy means a lot to me. So what I want to do here is tell you about the project and give you 2 images and stories that symbolize what I learned. So brief history, brief geography question: where is Kyrgyzstan?
Kurdistan?
Kyrgyzstan. Thank you. K-Y-R-G-Y-Z. S-T-A-N.
Next to Afghanistan.
Next to Afghanistan. Yeah. Yeah, let me, so I did a map. Hit the right arrow. There we go, right? That's good. So, here we go. And it has been, this is of course simplistic, but there are three major cultural influences here. One is China. It's very much an Asian, it's called Central Asia, it's very much an Asian culture. It's Muslim as well, although they have their own brand of Muslim that, Islam that other Muslim cultures may not recognize as such. There were a lot of kind of pork-flavored potato chips going on. And then it is also a former member of the Soviet Union. So there are three kind of very big cultural forces at play. I'll just give you a couple slides to show you. It's a really very rural. This is a really common sight to be driving along. And that affects the way that people live. So there's a central, the capital is Bishkek. It's got about 1 million people, but pretty much everybody else lives in smaller towns and cities. This was in the town. And there's the university that I worked at. This was a toy, a circumcision feast. My children's school, I sent them off to school. This was where we lived, and my family was here, and then we lived kind of cheek by jowl with a Kyrgyz family. And the young woman who lived in that family, Zarita, had herself been kidnapped. So we were living very closely with this phenomenon. And in fact, kidnapping is a major fact of life in Kyrgyzstan for young women. Up to 50% of marriages, and in rural areas, 80% of marriages begin this way. There is a range of kind of versions of consent. You know what that means? Sometimes people know they'll be kidnapped, sometimes they're taken off the street. But it was a very big deal among the university students that I worked with because universities were, you know, these were young women were marriageable age, and so it was a constant topic of conversation, lots of jokes about it. When we had Thanksgiving, one of the students started to bake put the turkey in the oven to celebrate an American Thanksgiving in the English club, and was kidnapped before it was finished. Oh, so her mother finished the turkey. You know, this was kind of an arranged one, and her mother finished the turkey and brought it in the next day. So, you know, it really touched our lives. In a typical kidnapping, a young man will decide it's time for him to marry. He's often under great pressure from his mother, who has been doing household labor for 20 years, right, and is, you know, legitimately looking for a break. There's a lot of cooking, cleaning, help with animals because it's a rural society. So the young man and his friends will drink a lot of vodka and they'll drive around in search of a suitable candidate. And sometimes it's a girlfriend, sometimes it's someone, you know, off the street. It really does happen. Once they see a likely young woman, they'll grab her, force her into a car, and drive her to the young man's house, at which point the young men give her over to the older female relatives. And there'll be a crowd of women relatives, and they have a juluk, or a white wedding scarf. And there's this whole sort of negotiation where they're trying to put the white wedding scarf on the bride's head, and she'll resist, and she kind of has to resist. There's a whole sort of theater piece to it too, because you can't be too willing to get married. But this will go on for hours and hours, sometimes up to 24 hours, and when she finally accepts the scarf, that is, she's considered married. It's hard to tell, but there is sometimes a threat or the reality of sexual violence as a way to kind of break women's spirits and to force them to listen. So bride kidnapping had been studied by anthropologists and sociologists, but there had been no oral histories with Kyrgyz people talking about it in their own words. My Kyrgyz colleagues it was very personal to them. They had had a number of students kidnapped, but a couple years previous there had been 2 suicides of young women who were kidnapped and taken and had committed suicide, and that was pretty unusual. And so that got a lot of attention. There was legislation passed on the basis of that. And so my colleagues, you know, when we were looking around, you know, we were all interested in women's studies, we all identify as feminists. They said, this is the project we want to do. So it was an interesting one for me to negotiate, and this is partly about how I did that. Here's our research team. I know it's difficult to remember Kyrgyz names, so I'm going to refer to us as myself, Sark translator. This is John, who is a sociologist, and Jamila, an oral historian. And it is important to my story about our background. So actually, Dana gave a great introduction. American Studies, I have not done an oral history project up to this point. I was really interested in it. I felt like it was a methodology that made a lot of sense. I liked the idea of allowing people to speak in their own words and make meaning themselves, sort of in combination with the oral history. But I was new to oral history. Jonal was my Kyrgyz colleague, and I would say she really directed the project. She was a sociologist. She had trained as an oral historian, and she'd done 2 previous major oral history projects. One had won the President's Prize. So she was a very accomplished oral historian. This is Dr. Jamila Aslanilieva. She was a historian. She had done previous research on Bradley. She was a political activist, and she always just reminded me of Gloria Steinem. She was so elegant, beautifully dressed, these gorgeous hands, her manicured. But so she had not done oral history work before. And then our translator, Maren Llewellyn, was a Peace Corps volunteer who started as a translator and then became a full member. This is what our meetings look like. We meet every Tuesday afternoon, and it was a very social occasion. Lots of tea and sweets as well. So originally, this is the department secretary, a young woman named Gildas, who had been kidnapped herself and had 2 children with her husband. She had stayed with him. And so, but she was kind of there. She was very deferential because it was a culture of deferring to one's elders. But she was also in the room when we were having these discussions, and so it was a very interesting thing to be talking about this in a scholarly, academic sense, and then to have someone who was living this reality, serving tea at the same time. So originally we imagined the project about being recovering female voices, and we planned to interview just kidnapped women, both those who had escaped and those who had stayed. But we soon realized it was really important to interview others too, grooms, the parents, friends, neighbors who participated in this process. And we decided to interview as many participants as we could. By the end, a total of nearly 50 interviews. The stories were stunning, dangerous, I called them in my title. They described how young women resisted kidnapping. They would leave the house, they would wait till everyone drunk had passed out and then leave the house at night in their socks. They would hitchhike home on, with cars at night. They would run over the countryside. They would pretend, and one woman said, well, you gotta pretend not to be a virgin, and you're not very good marriage material anymore. And they would hold up, one of them had described holding off her captors with a scythe that she found. But they also told, so they told these stories of resistance. They also told stories of sexual assault, of police who cooperated with the kidnappers, and of domestic abuse. And they told how the women who stayed learned to live with their captors as husbands. So they were, in the language of the critical race scholars Daniel Solorzano and Terry Yosso, counter stories. Do you know this term? Yeah, right. So there's the dominant language and these were counter stories. So the lessons we learned. I want to tell 2 stories. The first is about a missing voice recorder. I was pretty sure we were going to encounter some cross-cultural issues, and that was something I was really listening for. One thing we did that worked extremely well that I would do again in a heartbeat is the IRD. And as oral historians, it's a little bit sketchy. It's, you're not really considering that you've got human subjects that you're studying, right? But nonetheless, we found it incredibly useful as a way to articulate all of our assumptions and how we were going to recruit our people that we were going to talk to, how we were going to do with consent, how we were going to archive them. For example, consent in Kyrgyz culture is very oral. There's not a lot of written documentation. And so the kind of standard consent form where you sign it, you can imagine, right? My colleagues were like, no way, they're never going to do it. So what we did instead was we said, we need consent, So we recorded it orally at the beginning of the interview. I hereby consent. So we got our IRB approved, and the interviews started to come in. We had 5, 6, 7 of them. We were working within a transcript form, and we were sitting around the table, and our historian wasn't there that day, but we were leaning over, and we said, wow, she's interviewed some very articulate people. There's no there's no there's no gap, there's no sentence restarting. And we kind of looked at each other, and we said, is she recording this? And it turned out, as a historian, she was really focused on getting the names and the dates and the facts and all that stuff. So she would take notes in shorthand, and she would go home and she would write it out in narrative form. But for oral historians, for sociologists, it's partly about the ways in which people express themselves, like the language, the jokes, the way they start to cry, you know, all of that stuff. And so I had been so focused on, well, can the Kyrgyz people and the American people understand each other, that I had sort of missed this whole disciplinary disjunction. So it worked out okay. We were able to get a tape recorder for her. And then that conversation prompted this other conversation about, well, John Ball, who's the head sociologist, who is the oral historian, how are you recording? And she said, well, you know, the computerized recorders are very expensive. I can't afford those. I'm taping over the oral histories that I did on my prize-winning project. Right? You know, which makes total sense, you know. But then I, of course, another ad for Fulbright, there's money, you know, and so we were able to get some money and get her a recorder. But it was just a fascinating, it was not the cultural, you know, it was a different kind of cultural misunderstanding than what I expected. The second story is about my relationship to the politics of the project. And for me, that's symbolized by this manicured fist. Jamila was she's fabulously dressed, and she had this beautiful little, beautifully manicured hands. One time she had to leave one of our meetings because she had a manicure schedule, and then little rose moons on her hands, and she would hold up her fist and she would say, "We must struggle," you know, and sort of, and it was, you know, so it was really fun for me to kind of see this different version of what, you know, sort of a self-identified feminist. And she, so she was very clear, both of them were very clear that this was a political project. And I thought, that makes total sense for them. For me, as a Westerner, what's my relationship with it, right? And I really struggled with that. And I thought, well, you know, there's this effort to understand kidnapping, an effort to stop it. You know, my role as a scholar here is not to judge, but it's to provide understanding. And so I felt pretty comfortable with that kind of moral relativist stance, or cultural relativist stance. It felt very nice, clean, morally unambiguous, and I went with that until one day I had a student come into my office, Aidana, she was 18, and she said she wanted me to see a movie about kidnapping, and she told me the story of her sister's kidnapping by a man she didn't know, and how the sister was taken away and called the family every night, you know, crying and saying, "Please take me back, please take me back." And the parents said, you know, you just need to stay with this man. And so then the sister kind of eventually escaped and moved out to Germany, where she was living with a boyfriend, which is just inconceivable in rural Kyrgyz culture. And so Aidana told me the story, and she said, you know, I don't go to the villages. I'll stay in the city because I don't go to the villages. I don't want to be kidnapped myself. And when I hear a car coming behind me, you know, so I'm sitting there listening, and she said, what do you think? And I said, well, and she said, doesn't it make you angry? And I realized, yeah, it did, you know? And then I couldn't hold that stance of cultural relativism anymore. But, which put me in an absolute pickle. What was my stance? You know, like, how do I negotiate this? Do I even have a role here? Which I think is kind of one of the key questions, right? And so we talked a lot. I talked a lot with her translator, who was a really brilliant woman, and she said, you know, I think our role is, you know, it's not giving voice to people, but it's giving them a megaphone. Because Kyrgyz women's voices in this culture are so silenced that the megaphone allows, you know, them to kind of enter a conversation. So that made a lot of sense to me. The lesson, so what we've done in Kyrgyzstan is we published a book of these stories in both Kyrgyz and Russian. And we've done it without a lot of editorializing. Here are the stories as a kind of mirror for Kyrgyz society. Here's what's happened, right? And it does serve as a counter story. But the question that I'm wrestling with now is, what do we do in a Western context? My colleague, Jonal, would really like to publish for her own personal ambitions, which I totally get. She wants to publish in a scholarly Western journal. I think that's great. I'm a little uncomfortable with what happens to this material once it comes into Western culture. And there's, if you're interested, I can give you some videos to watch. But there's one that's done by Vice News, right, about kidnapping your bride. And it's like, this is full animal kingdom to get your bride at the watering hole, right? And I feel like there's that kind of, you know, that, I don't want to play into that. But I'm not sure what I can do responsibly as a scholar. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The challenge of doing oral research cross-culturally, that is amazing. I'm glad this is being recorded so that I can use some of this in my research methods course. Great, thank you very much. And under the allotted time, like Vanessa as well. Okay, right. So you have a PowerPoint, right? So you want to set it up. Oh, I don't know if we can connect your computer. Maybe you can get it from the email?
I just sent it to you.
Well, I don't have access to it, so why don't you, let's see.
I have a USB, would that help?
Maybe put it in. Or you can log into the internet. But that might be faster.
Morton, while this is going on, maybe we can ask some questions.
Yeah, sure.
So, this experience was done, you had this experience a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah, 4 years ago now.
What has evolved from
Well, if I were a faster worker, what's evolved is we've done this book about 2 years ago. We have a book published in Business Society. I've done a number of conference papers. There was some interest from a university press in working with me and John to kind of do a dual-voiced book that would talk about the challenges of doing oral history cross-culturally. I'm really interested in that. I haven't had time to do it. So that's kind of what I'm thinking, is to to use these voices as to speak both together and then also a counterpoint about our experience. Yeah.
your scholarly and very passionate research, compassionate as well as passionate research, has it had an effect on the issue itself?
You know how to log in here?
That is a great. As I was typing this up this morning, I thought I should get in touch with John and find out what she's seeing. What the biggest thing that had an impact actually was these 2 suicides prompted legislation to criminalize kidnapping in a way that was different. And before, it was the penalty for stealing a sheep was greater than the penalty for stealing a bride.
Oh,
Yeah, which I mean, for us, right? That was region, are you?
I was offered another bride, another wife, if I stayed in Iraq another year. And they're desperately serious about it. They're saying, we give you a nice wife from the tribe, you know what I mean? And it's the tribe's honor, so that they would make sure that, how can I say it, that she was appropriate for my stature in the tribe. I was going to ask you about honor killings, because that's a big issue in the Middle East, and it's starting to show up here in the United States. People who have emigrated to the United States, they don't see it. You know what I mean by an honor killing? In their world, I'll just briefly say, they sometimes get married when they're children, okay? The families combine to make a powerful block. And if the husband doesn't like who he's going to marry, notice how I'm saying that the husband doesn't like, he'll say she wasn't intact on the wedding night. And the bride's family is duty bound to kill her, even if it's not true, okay? And so you have these incredible, and it's very, I was shocked when I first started to hear about it, but I just wanted to just ask, do they do something like that? This kidnapping brides is, I'm amazed at that, that they get away with that, So anyway, I just wanted to ask you, are there any honor
I
killings?
was not aware of any honor killing. And I think that may be one difference too, where like Islam is really different in different regions, and Kurdistan is definitely Islam light.
Well, I was going to say, if they're eating pork rinds and drinking vodka, it's gotta be,
Different.
because when I've stayed in Islamic areas where I was staying, man, you get caught with alcohol, you're dead, okay? You get caught. That's why everyone was smoking marijuana at one point in Hashish, because they could get away with that, because that's why they had big hookahs and everything else, was because it was smoking, not drinking.
Yeah.
And yet, on the other hand, in listening to you, it was, by the way, both presentations were great. I was just thinking, in my time in the Islamic States, how's that honor? Because I was, and they'll disguise it by saying she accidentally fell down a well, or she was doused in kerosene, and unfortunately, she was set on fire. You know what I mean, by mistake, okay? And maybe one last graphic example. I was in Jerusalem, of all places, And I was in East Jerusalem, which is predominantly Arabic. And I went up to get some special, I have a real weakness for the big sesame roll, you know, bagel type thing. And so I stood in the back of the line of women, and he took a stick out and said, huh, huh, huh. And all the women backed up, and he said, come, come, come. And I came up, and I looked at the women, they're all, and I said, I just want to go. When I went into Turkey, we're going through special security to go through Turkey, and the head of security comes over and says, you, out of line. And I went like, oh, what have I done, okay? They were all women around me. And he said, you're not, you go first.
Ready?
And the American women were like
Okay.
freaking out, okay? And I was looking, he isn't any better than I am. Why is he going to the front? And look at that man go up there. He just went up there. You know what I'm going like, for God's sake, don't mess with these. You're in a Muslim country right now. They can stone you to death if they want to.
Predominantly Muslim country.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so you have about 90 minutes, okay? And I'll give you heads up when you have 5 minutes and 2 minutes. Okay, last but not least, Bright is our presenter. Bright Owusu Gayasi is originally from Ghana, attended the University of Pakenham in London, and the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. He has a master's in global affairs and diplomacy and a BA in philosophy and sociology. And he was a former technical member of the United Nations post-2015 National and Global Development Consultation, which I did not know, even though I worked closely with him. So he'll be presenting on youth unemployment, development, political stability in Sub-Saharan Africa, the cases of Ghana and Nigeria. We've been everywhere today, right? We've been to Ghana, Kyrgyzstan, and now Ghana and Nigeria.
Right.
Okay, so go for it.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Bright, and I will just take us straight to action since we don't have time. So apparently I'm talking about youth unemployment in Ghana, in Africa, the cases of Ghana and Nigeria to be specific. Me being a youth myself, the issue of unemployment appears to be something very dedicated to my heart, considering the fact that I see people of my age who struggles to, earn a living. So what is unemployment? Unemployment means economically active population without work and are available or seeking for work. The unemployment of the youth, as I indicated earlier, happens to be a significant obstacle to the economic growth of any economy or country. Probably the reason for which I'm particularly interested in the topic. In this case, we are talking about Africa, and we will narrow it down to the two countries. Africa, as we know, happens to be the continent with the most youthful population, with 60 to 70% of the population, considered to be youth. So you can tell that it has a growth potential for that age group. So close to about 10 million youths graduate from over 668 universities across Africa globally are unable to find employment opportunities, which of course happens to be a security threat, because if everybody's sick or concerned and these people are roaming the street hungry, anger can cause them to do something that will distract the peace and stability of any community. In Ghana, the youth population falls within the ages of 15 to 35, which happens to be in accordance with the African Union definition of who a youth happens to be. The age group that's 15 to 35 account for about about a third, which is 33.5 of the total country population. Again, also a figure which is quite significant that poses a serious security threat to the peace and stability of the country. Unemployment happens to be higher within the ages of 15 to 24, and that's because that's the age group that are coming out of universities fresh. So most employers are reluctant on employing such people due to lack of relevant or prior work experience. About 250,000 young men and women enters the Ghanaian labor market annually. With this figure, which is the 250,000, only 2% are absorbed into the formal sectors of the economy, which means that for the people that have access to jobs where they can sit as a graduate with a decent environment, only 2% out of this amount of figure are able to do that. So you notice that 98% then goes back or relies on the informal sectors of the economy, which in effect, that is going to most likely lead to underemployment or no employment at all. These figures are according to the Ghana Statistical Survey. The youth unemployment rate is higher among the educated, and when I say educated, what I mean is the university graduates. That's because they are also coming fresh out of school. They have no prior experiences, and most companies are reluctant to employ them, which of course, poses the question or brings to mind that as government and policy makers will have to, bring up or, kind of formulate a curriculum that will be geared towards more technical education, where the youth can have mentorship and that will help them build experience while they gain formal education. Ghana presently consists of about 57% of youth. Over the past 50 years, the number of youth population has increased from 1.1 million in 1960 to 2.3 million in 1948 and to an enormous 3.5 million in 2000. To an enormous 13.7 million in 2010, also as reported by the Ghana Statistical Survey. So that is the case of Ghana, which you can tell that there is a lot section of the population who are roaming the street of Accra looking for employment opportunities that they are unable to get. What happens, or what we see, or I personally see this as a great security situation that if it's not curtailed, it could develop into something that again could destabilize the country. Now let's move on, fast forward to Nigeria. Nigeria happens to be a neighbor to Ghana, so right from Ghana, let's step into Nigeria with no flight. Nigeria is said to have reached about 167 million in 2012. Now in 2019, the population of Nigeria is about 200 million, close to that of the United States. According to the National Population Commission, half of the population of Nigeria out of this figure happens to be youth. The reason for which the country has not seen peace in contemporary times, because there is a lot of active, young, dynamic people who cannot find jobs, people who are hungry, roaming the streets of Lagos looking for opportunities that do not exist due to lack of pragmatic policies or educational curriculum that will prepare them to be able to have access to some of these opportunities. Unemployed youth total about 11.1 million in 2012. In terms of age, younger youth struggle even more to find jobs. And you can see a relation between that and that of the Ghanaian situation. You notice that in Ghana, the ages of 15 to 24 is hard for them to get opportunities because of lack of relevant job experience. That's the same case as that of Nigeria. And at least 2/3 of unemployed youth are between 15 to 24, which is quite close to that of the Ghana situation. And in terms of gender, available statistics indicate that the females are even, are more in terms of not being able to find jobs. So it appears the young men somehow struggles, but they are able to make their way as compared to that of the females, which of course lead most of them to engage in petty trading. So there are times you can walk in traffic, and I can talk in terms of Ghana for myself, that I have witnessed, that I have seen my colleague who was selling bread in traffic, where you see a traffic jam. I saw someone selling something who looked so quite close to someone I know, so I called upon him. He came and I noticed he was my friend, and what he told me is that since we graduated after his national service, he had something that he did for 2 years, but afterwards he was laid off, and since then has not been able to find a job. He has to earn a living, so he started something small, and he's selling bread. So that's how bad the situation could get. He is selling bread. There are others who feel that they do not deserve to be selling bread. Instead, they will go against the system out of anger and frustration, which again is a security threat. The unemployment is associated with high crimes in Nigeria, notably insurgency, militancy, Boko Haram, and prostitution. And part of the reason why Nigeria has always been at the ears of the news agencies, because there's always a lot going on. If you look at the population of youth who are roaming the streets of Lagos, the streets of Alabama, the streets of Anambra, and other states. So youth unemployment rate in Nigeria stood at 38%, which is even high as projected in 2010, which again brings a case or concern for all of us. The frustration aggression theory indicates that when there is a group with shared grievances in relation to marginalization and neglect, there is a tendency that violence may erupt. The reason why we have not seen peace in Nigeria and shall not see peace in Nigeria until these youth, are being able to get access to employable opportunities. The reason for which Boko Haram see the region as the reason for which Boko Haram sees the region as a peaceful place to operate. Most of the youth that are being recruited by Boko Haram are youth who have not had jobs ever since they graduated from school. Out of frustration, out of anger, they are promised, something that might not even exist. But due to frustration, they join the movement and start causing mayhem, destabilizing the country, reducing economic growth. The effect of unemployment in Nigeria has also led to increase in rural-urban migration. You notice that most of the youth are moving from all the other villages and cities of Nigeria into Lagos. So you notice that Lagos is highly populated, and when they get there and they are not able to get employment opportunities, the lady resorts to prostitution. The men will also resort to armed robbery. They will join militant group, and we hear bad news about Nigeria because of that. There is also high levels of poverty in Nigeria. We talk about the GDP growth of Nigeria being one of the best in Africa, but then you happen to know that the GDP growth of Nigeria appears, that's the entire world of the country, appears to belong to only about 5% of that population. So you notice that even though the GDP growth is high, we are talking about economic prospects in Nigeria, how big the Nigerian economy is, but there is a strong inequality between the small section of people who owns the money and the masses who have nothing at all. There are people in Nigeria who probably live off less than $20 in the whole year. So that it is by no reason that we have always heard of crimes in that beautiful country of Nigeria. With a high population, all the natural resources at this stake, the country has since not been able to provide employment opportunity for its youth, and that is basically not due to nothing but lack of policies and pragmatic measures by people in leadership positions. Unemployment also leads to psychological distress, and there has been a correlation between unemployment and poor mental state, because when the people roam, why have I attended college, come on up to this point, and I cannot get employment opportunities? I have done my part as a citizen. My country has to make available opportunities for me to use my skills to support the development and growth of my country. But here I am struggling for years not having jobs. Some of them think about the situation and it causes mental distress to them. That's according to the World Health Organization. And again, here I talk about the depression and exaggeration create fertile grounds for crime to take root, multiply. The condition results in increasing violent crimes in Nigeria. So, some thoughts and solutions, recommendations that I believe that if we take into consideration might help, reduce the unemployment situation in Ghana and in Nigeria. Now, here I talk about we need to place less emphasis on Eurocentric curriculums and also introduce more Afrocentric curriculum with skills and development at the core center of it. What I mean by that is that our curriculum, when I went to school, even at the secondary cycle session, you would be asked to draw something like a pig, label the part, draw a dog, label the part. I ask myself sometimes, what is the relevance of these activities to my life as a person? You are asking me to draw a dog and label the part, so we have to modify our curriculum to put in measures that will help the youth, it will inculcate problem-solving skills. We have to discuss the problems of our countries and the solutions involved, so that people will grow with it, knowing very well what the situations are, what is needed to be done to, solve the situation for good and for economic growth. In unity lies strength, that the unity of the continent will safeguard the interest and independence of all African states and foster speedy continental development. What I mean by that is that I talk about the unity of the African continent as stated by Sergeant Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana on the 24th of May 1963 in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, where he states that the independence of Ghana at the time alone in 1957 was not enough unless it was linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. In Africa, we have I live in Ghana, I fly to Nigeria in less than 30 minutes. I will need a passport to be able to go through that. I will need a yellow fever certificate. I fly from Nigeria to South Africa, I will have to go through the same process. My Ghanaian cedi that I have with me, if I take the Ghanaian cedi to Nigeria, I cannot use it. My cedi is useless in Nigeria. If I go to Congo, it's the same thing. If I go to South Africa, it's the same thing. So you notice that here in the United States, because it is united, somebody can fly from San Francisco to New York for hours and will not have to show a yellow fever certificate and will not need a visa, the reason for which we see economic activities booming and the United States happens to have the best and the strongest economy in the world. Africa can do this. We can come together and have a stronger currency, a stronger bargaining power to be able to, address our issues and concerns. And because there is no unity, you see the smaller countries like Sao Tome and Principe with a GDP growth of under $1 billion goes into a negotiation with China with a GDP growth of about 15 to 14 trillion dollars. I mean, you cannot expect to be fairness. So we talk about the fact that China is exploiting Africa, but China is exploiting Africa because of the package we have presented. If we all come together, we will be seen as a stronger force, we will be respected, we will have a strong bargaining power, and our problems and challenges, we will be able to have a platform to address them. I also talk about the establishment of African Institute centers within our universities, which will instill into our youth the sense of Africanism. We will be a united Africa will produce a stronger currency and a stronger voice for negotiation. Patriotism that focuses on our shared destiny as a continent should also be introduced into our curriculum. An African think tank that includes the world experienced leaders across the spectrum of agriculture to education to health to communication and science must collaborate with our youth who possesses the world of fresh thinking, creativity, and innovation to create a robust African synergy of new strategies, pinpointing the way forward into which our youth will be committed to implement. So here also I talk about we doing a cross-fertilization of ideas within the African continent, different fields, we as a continent coming together to brainstorm, to have a united force, a united workforce with experience that we can address our issues collectively, share experiences, and also present a stronger bargaining power to the world. I am also talking here about entrepreneurship and technical education being the forecourt of our curriculum that I already indicated earlier, that our curriculum should be structured in a way that will produce graduates with skills development and not graduates who become job seekers. Deliberate policy action for African countries, which the government agreed to a 10% national budgetary allocation for agriculture. What I mean is that we also need to enforce this policy that was declared in Maputo in 2019, where all the heads of state of the African country agreed that they will allocate 10% of their budgetary, 10% budgetary allocation for agriculture. And why I talk about agriculture is that Africa is a very fertile continent. We have the best climate conditions, we have the workforce, so why can we not mechanize agriculture so the seeming youth can get into it? Because Africa happens to be a country that cannot feed itself. We import rice from China, we import chocolate from Sweden. I mean, we import basically everything. The situation is like we produce what we don't need and then we eat what we don't produce. So there appears to be some imbalances here, and that's why the country is facing starvation. That's why Africa, in Ghana, my country, we import almost about 1 billion amount of rice every year. Whereas we have fertile lands, that we have people who are not getting job opportunities. Why can we not organize these people, put them on the land, make economic policies that, money will be available to have mechanized agriculture equipment so we can produce on large scales, feed ourselves and import the rest to the world to sell and make money, grow the economy, employ the youth, and then let people be full. So there appears to be a disconnect between the problems and the solution. Our leaders are seen not to be doing that what they're supposed to be doing in terms of policies that will help alleviate poverty. So that's it. I want to thank you.
Under the time allotted, so that's great. Thank you very much for your very, all of you for very efficient and well organized and very thought-provoking presentations. I'm sure we're all overflowing with lots of thoughts and comments and questions. Great, so I think why don't we just jump right into it. So, Gary, you have a
Are you
question?
thinking right about a model like the European Union, that kind of thing?
You say a model like the European Union?
Yeah.
Well, we have something called the African Union.
Yeah.
But the sad part of it is that the African Union has not been that effective as the European Union. The goal of the African Union when it was set up in the 1960s was to make sure that they work together to see that Africa come together. You know, the main goal was to establish an African state. But the goal of the union has not been successful, or has not been successful as we speak now. So it's more like a Mickey Mouse union, if I would say. It has not really worked, or it has not worked as it was intended or supposed to have been.
So does that mean it won't work for Africa?
Well, if you ask me, I believe that the African Union, they will have to restructure. We have to know what the purpose is for, what it is intended for. Because we have had issues in Africa where the European Union will have to come in and help, where the US will have to come in and help. We have issues going on in Burundi, we have issues going on in Eritrea, issues going on in Sudan, issues going on in Liberia. In all of these issues and in all of this conflict, no one was the African Union able to successfully bring peace to without the help of the EU, which is the European Union you talked about. So it has not been successful as we would have wished it's supposed to be.
I will be heading for Burundi on Monday. So one of the things that resonated as someone who's working in education there, especially in higher education, is the disconnect between sort of the economic models and the educational models that you talked about in Ghana and in Nigeria. And I see those also. So as you reflect and thinking about the sort of what needs to happen, because obviously if we're producing, and I worry about this myself, we're producing master students. You know, what are the jobs going to be when they get out from the program, and the other programs that the college are associated with there. So what as you look at this and as you think about from the experiences looking at Nigeria and Ghana, what are the kinds of conversations that need to happen between education and sort of the economic, the employment sector that better align those so that we don't have a lot of, you know, good things happening because we're educating people, but you're right, I do see the frustration as people finish up and they don't have viable employment. So how can we think better about that? And I have a dozen questions we can talk about later, but that one specific.
I would say what we need to do first of all is to address the educational system, not the system, I'm sorry, the curriculums.
Okay.
Because you notice that it is more of a theoretical one, something that was imposed on us back in the days by the Europeans. And I don't mean they meant it for bad, but at the time that was what was needed, because we needed to be educated in other ways. And education at that point was theoretical. They were not trying to train us to do other stuff, but they were trying to help us to, you know, be able to speak, communicate, and then, so I believe that the curriculum that was written 50 years back is not good for today. So what policymakers in the education sector, the Ministry of Education, and it's quite amazing, you go to Africa, we have all the titles for this, and you wonder what they have been doing over the years in terms of reforms to, you know, find a way to put in staff that are needed in contemporary time to solve contemporary problems. And one of the problems I see again is probably because we have been, over the years, we have been electing, you know, quite older people, so they appear not to be in touch with the reality. You know, I believe that it's about time, you know, we give the youth also opportunities into leadership positions because we know our problems. You know, we cannot keep electing people who have experience. Experience is good, you know, don't get me wrong. But I believe those are people who can serve on council of elders, who can advise the youth to implement and solve their own problems. Because obviously, the old men back then do not know the problems of today. The world has changed a whole lot. So we need to reform our curriculums and make sure that we, you know, fixing the technical ones, vocational, mentorship, internship, to prepare the youth to become job creators instead of job seekers.
Yeah, fascinating conversation. I also, this summer I was in Rwanda at the University of Global Health Equity, and I was so struck by what an extraordinary success story Rwanda seems to be. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, and I know that it's not a democratic country necessarily, but I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of, you know, how it's developed its economy and it's doing.
That's a very good question. Thank you very much. Because I personally love Rwanda, and Rwanda today happens to be the top of town country in Africa. Everybody acknowledges that a country that went through all those atrocities, and within a small space of time, Rwanda, you go to Rwanda, it looks like the West. You know, a friend of mine was at the airport and could not even believe where he was. Rwanda is building accommodation facilities for the homeless. You know, top quality stuff. Why? Leadership. So the problem of Africa is as put by Chinua Achebe of Nigeria. He said the problem of Africa is not the African person, it's not the African climate, it's not the African land, but lack of leadership. So we have had leadership problems. That's why I said that the leaders appear to be disconnected with what needs to be done. That Paul Kagame has been very successful. Yes, he's not democratic, but then personally, if I compare what he has been able to achieve in relation to him not being democratic, and that brings
I would take it any day.
right.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that brings the question in mind that is Africa really ready for democracy? Because it appears that democracy is not working for us the way it is supposed to do. Because Rwanda is not a democratic country, really, but they are now the top of town in terms of progress. So maybe Africans are people, you know, we need a strong leader, someone who leads with force. Do this, let's do this, let's do that.
We need bright leaders like you.
Exactly.
Yes, let's go there.
First of all, congratulations to all of the presenters. You did an outstanding job. To my brother Bright, I must ask, in conjunction with the weak leadership, could the lack of industrialization be contributing to the surplus of folks who are roaming the streets without jobs?
Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. Industrialization. That's why the section I paid for industrialization in was agriculture. Like we can industrialize the agricultural sector because of the land. But again, you talk about weak leadership. The leaders are not coming up with such innovative ideas. You know, the youth cannot do that. You know, they have the political power, they have the state resources. We have, the amazing thing is that we have something we call bumper seasons. In the bumper season, like in the bumper season for tomatoes, when the season comes, there will be so much tomatoes that some of the farmers will have to trash their tomatoes, because you know tomatoes don't stay that long. They can't stay for I think even 2 weeks or even a month. So what does the government has to do? Set up, you know, tomatoes processing factories. The youth will go there, some will work as administrators, other people will go in and work as laborers, everybody will have something decent. Let's produce tomatoes in large quantities, export to the nearby countries, let's make some money, let's employ the people also to eat, but it boils down to leadership. So ask me, how many factories do we have in Ghana as we speak? I do not know for sure, but I can say without fear and favor that we cannot count. We cannot, and I say this on authority, that in a country which happens to be a population of about 28 million in 2019, we cannot boast of 200 factories. And when I say 200, I'm talking about factories that even employs more than 2,000 people. That employs 2,000 people. With that, we cannot even boast of 100. I mean, if we want to think about factories like that, we only say about 50.
So Bright will have another opportunity to present his paper at the University of Texas in Austin. Actually, he got 2 offers. So now let's turn our attention to Melissa's and Dr. Tichau's presentation. I actually can start if nobody else has any questions. So are all the Northern Greens or the Northern NGOs that promote wilderness conservation? Are the you talked about the
Big
northern
conservation organizations.
conservation organizations who are responsible for the plight of the indigenous. But is what they promote in terms of the discourse of conservation is everything to blame? Is there a room for sort of coupling conservation with development? That would help.
Sure, and part of the problem in some of the areas too is not just the conservation organizations, but the support of the government as well. In some areas, the support of the government is much stronger for indigenous people. For many years in South America, for example, is FUNAI, which is an organization that protects all of the indigenous populations in the Amazon. So there's a lot of them. But unfortunately, government is changing, presidents change, support changes, and they were actually talking about making FUNAI completely defunct at that point. So there's no indigenous protection police, basically. So all of these people are kind of left to their own devices at that point. It's also not just the conservation organizations. They also get help in policing these regions from local organizations, from like places that will help them guard and protect the area. Well, and then those people are given the liberty to act as they see fit. So that's when you end up with people being beaten and shot and dying of thirst because they can't get back to their water sources, that kind of thing. So it's more the process of the implementation and the mindset behind how this is all brought about that's really the problem. So the idea of conservation, of course, is a wonderful idea, but I really think that they're missing an opportunity in relying almost exclusively on their own experiences and their own ideas of how things should be done without first reaching out to those local communities and cooperating with them and getting their input and getting their assistance in all of this.
I'm so glad you spoke to the government because I was going to ask, what about the policies of the country around this?
Yes.
But you at least mentioned that just a minute ago. So I'm going to move on to what was going to be my second question, and that is your comments about ecotourism. Some of us have supported ecotourism because we thought we were doing a good thing, to support, that, we get folks wanting to see the animals and the environment and the natural state, then that would be a good thing and would be protected. But I gather from your comments that that's not always the case.
Not always, correct.
Would you say a little more?
Sure.
So that do I now not need to go on these ecotourism, sites because it's a bad thing? I'll stop. But, I can stop.
As long as you don't hunt and endanger.
That's right. Camera safaris.
So see, and I think that's the difference, is that you're respectful of the environment and you want to learn and you want to appreciate the nature as it is and as it stands. But not everybody has that idea. They go on ecotourism trips in the same way that they would go on a savannah tour. They'll leave their plastic bottles, they'll leave their foodstuffs behind, they'll go to the bathroom in the jungle and not cover it, So, really, you're taking people out of the city, but you're not taking the city out of the people. So, in some cases, obviously it works very well. It gathers support, it encourages people, and they really do learn a lot about the environment, how to protect. But in a lot of cases, the people just aren't respectful enough to make it worth the difference. Wow.
Beautiful.
Hi, I'm Melissa, I'm just curious, because you said there's a lot of conservation organizations that are kind of like helping with this problem. I'm just curious how many of these are actual legal conservations and translation, because I feel that is the huge gap. They need lawyers, they need people to help with translation.
Well, it seems like it's mostly those big international organizations like WWF and things like that, where they work all around the world, they work globally, but they keep that Western mindset. It seems like that's the problem. When you have more local conservation groups, they're already familiar with how people interact and behave and work with the environment. But it's when somebody comes in that's not familiar with the cultures and with the region, and they just dictate from on high how things are supposed to go.
In Bright's case, we have an overabundance of educated individuals. To what extent does educating the youth who do not want to return to those areas have an effect?
I'm not sure I quite understand what you're getting at.
You're having the youth being educated and introduced to a new way of life.
I see what you mean.
A better, well, not better way of life,
Different.
but a different way of life. Thank you. To what extent is that playing a part in the population dwindling and not supporting the culture and the native nature of the area?
To my perspective, the best lives for these people are to live as they will. You know, they to live as their ancestors have, as their families have for generation after generation after generation. And it's when they are forced to come into contact with these outside ideals and methods of living, that's when their own culture starts to suffer. Because they've kind of been absorbed into the Western way of doing things, out of necessity entirely, then their own cultures suffer from the loss of now these youths from these indigenous groups. Now they've become more globalized, they've become more educated about the outside world. Well, can they just go back to a simple cultural existence at that point? Do they even fit in anymore at that point? Do they even want to fit in? And if they don't, if that's the attitude of the youths, what chance is there for new generations? You know, and eventually the whole culture dies out.
Exactly.
We have one more question, hopefully, for Dr. T. Charles.
Could you explain the phrase arranged kidnapping? It seems like a contradiction in terms.
Thank you,
So,
that's what I wanted to.
So there's a wide spectrum, and one of the things that's so interesting about this practice is it can mean that Bright and his fiance say, we want to get married, but our parents won't let us, so, you know, Bright comes and kidnaps his fiance. Or it can mean that Negan is walking down the street and that, you know, and somebody really needs to get married because his, you know, his mother is putting this pressure on him and kidnaps her. So an arranged one would be more along here. Most typical would be that I say, you know, Bright, my son, you know, we have a friend of the family, and I think that you should marry her. And then it's, you know, kind of largely agreed upon. And then they do the kidnapping in order to avoid paying the expenses associated with the traditional wedding.
It's not
which are
really
significant, you know.
It's not really kidnapping as we understand.
So it's not right, you know, but then there's this theater piece where it all looks the same. So it's really difficult from the outside, and I think sometimes from the inside to understand, you know, what's consent in this situation.
Is there a bride price or dowry or?
The dowry is significant. It's in the northern region where the women are feistier, they get paid less. No way.
Well, I mean, feel free to leave. We can stay and talk about it, but that's all the time. The official
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
And then eventually somebody else will
What I'm saying to you is that
They take you, and I don't know what they've done to you, so you have to.
and also,
I gotta find out where my class is.
Oh, there, oh, yeah, here. Which class?
Yesterday.
so one thing you learn from repair generators, then you're not sitting in the streets blind something, you have something to do. And it takes, because we're here for the rest of the night, I always think so.
Yes, we are.
It takes their yes, because there's some times that they are moving more than they were working on it, and it's not money home. And so you keep all these different things.
The rest of the classes, are they back at the hotel here?
They're here